On this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly, let's read Electronic Gaming Monthly, issue 6 from January of 1990. Alright, so as I said, we're looking at EGM issue number 6 from January of 1990. So this would have been on newsstands maybe in very late December and all through the month of January. As it says here, display until January 31st. Now, just to give you sort of a flavor of the time, when this magazine was on newsstands, the Genesis and the TurboGrafx 16 had both been out for about 4 months, and the Game Boy had been out for 6 or 7 months. I'm not sure exactly when the Game Boy came out off the top of my head, but those 3 systems were out, but certainly the Nintendo Entertainment System was still the king of the hill. And as you can see here, Batman the video game is the cover story. Now that's the Batman video game based on the 1989 Michael Keaton movie. And that game actually came out for 3 different consoles. It was on the Nintendo NES, which is what they're referring to here. It actually also came out on the Game Boy, which I have right here, and I've had this one since I was a kid. And finally it came out on the Sega Genesis. And all 3 of those are actually different games. So they were all made by Sunsoft, but they, instead of like making one game and porting it to 3 different systems, which certainly would have been the easier thing to do, they actually just went ahead and made 3 completely different games, which is cool because all 3 games are great. You also see up here they have a first look at the NEC Super Graphics, and that's kind of interesting, if only because the TurboGrafx 16, as I said, had only been out for a handful of months, and here we are already talking about its successor, which at this point, whether or not it was coming out in this country was unknown. Up here in the corner, we've got bonus top secret, dozens and dozens of new tricks, codes, and tips, and they're not kidding. There are pages and pages of game tips and codes in here that we're just going to skip through as quickly as possible because I don't think it's particularly interesting for me to talk about or for you to hear about. Also here it says free in this issue, Mega Play, the all Sega mini mag. And that was just an insert in the middle of this magazine. Mega Play did end up becoming its own magazine that was published by the same folks that published this. That wouldn't happen until later. And then finally, we have a feature story called Future Play, first look at new games and systems. So that should be cool to check out. All right, so as we open to the inside cover here, you can see we've got an ad for FCI. So FCI stood for Fuji Saneki Communications International, and it was actually owned by Fuji TV, which kind of explains their corporate logo there. And the 2 games here that they're advertising are World Championship Wrestling and Phantom Fighter, both for the NES. Now, personally, when I think of FCI, the first game that comes to mind for me is Ultima Exodus for the NES. This was a game that I didn't have when I was a kid, but my best friend had it, and I used to go over to his house all the time and watch him play it. And as you can see there, this was an FCI release, and of course was based on the home computer game, which was Ultima 3, by the way. They don't say that on here because, of course, it was the first Ultima game on the NES. All right, here we've got the contents. No need to go through that. And then over here we've got an ad from Sunsoft for Fester's Quest. And what I think is kind of weird about that is, obviously this is a game that's based on the Addams Family. And in 1990, I'm not sure I understand who was really into the Addams Family, especially like how much overlap was there between people who were playing the NES and people who were into the Addams Family. I think if you drew a Venn diagram, you would have 2 circles that weren't even touching each other. But I actually remember renting this game at one point, I think because, maybe I'd gotten to the rental store too late to get anything, any of the sort of marquee games. But I'm sure, anybody else who grew up around the same time I did knows how that was, where, your mom or dad would take you to the rental place and just tell you, yeah, go ahead and get a game. And, even if there was only one game left on the shelf, you were going to grab it. Here we've just got some letters, nothing really too exciting to talk about in here. You got somebody here writing in asking if they can play Mega Drive, Japanese Mega Drive games on their Genesis, and if they can play PC Engine games on their TurboGrafx. And they're just letting them know that no, you cannot play PC Engine games in your TurboGrafx. This is probably before those diving board converters came out, but saying you actually can play Mega Drive games on your Genesis. Here we've got an ad from Capcom. We saw this exact same ad in the last Let's Read when I was doing the November '89 issue of GamePro with Mega Man 2 and Strider. So just first quickly over here, we've got another ad from Capcom. They don't really make it clear, but this is actually an ad for home computer ports of some of their arcade games, which is why the box art looks a little bit different than what you're used to seeing for Nintendo games. And of course they say in here, launch into battle at your favorite software retail outlet. So these were games that came out on like maybe the home PC and Amiga. Again, they don't really say, so you just would have to go to the store and find out. So here is where the reviews section starts. This was a format that they went with for a long time. They have the review crew where they had 4 people all reviewing these games. They just gave you a really short précis of what the game was all about, and then each reviewer really only wrote a few sentences about each game. So these were very basic reviews, just meant to sort of really be a recommendation of whether or not they thought the game was worth your time. The 4 members of the review crew for this issue are Steve, which is, of course, Steve Harris, the editor-in-chief, Ed Semrad. Now, Ed got his start writing a column for the Milwaukee Journal called Video Adventures. And what's noteworthy to me about that is that back then, especially because I think he started that column in like maybe 1982 or 1983, and they're really an invaluable resource of video games coverage, professional video games coverage from that time. A database of those is really an invaluable resource for covering topics in video gaming post-crash and before Nintendo had really helped revitalize the market here in North America. Next, you've got Martin Alessi, who was a longtime member of the EGM staff, and he actually also publishes a magazine called Little Players, and it's a game magazine aimed towards small children and their parents. And then last year we've got Jim Stockhausen, and I can't find any information on him, so I don't know who he is, I don't know where he came from, and I don't know where he went. So the 2 games we got on this page are Rolling Thunder for the NES, and that is a home port of a Namco arcade game. And I know it's sort of a fairly well-regarded game. I actually never ran across it, and I played a lot of arcade games, so either I saw it in the arcade and just wasn't interested in playing it, or I just happened to never see it. I have played it on the NES, and it's really, there's nothing that stands out to me about it. If you want to play like a side-scrolling action game, I think there are much better games out there. It's also very reminiscent of Golgo 13, although I believe Rolling Thunder, at least for sure in the arcade, Rolling Thunder predates Golgo 13, so I would say that one's sort of maybe a rip-off of this game. But like I said, they gave it, it's got 8768, so I mean they thought fairly highly of it, but like I said, it does nothing for me. And then here you've got Silkworm, which was actually a Tecmo arcade game that was ported to the NES. Kind of a cool side-scrolling shooter where you can be a helicopter or a jeep. So that's, I mean, it's kind of cool, I guess. Obviously, they didn't think much of it. I think they felt that it maybe was not a perfect translation, from the arcade, but what was at that time. Right, here we've got 3 more NES reviews, and this sort of highlights something that I don't really want to harp on, but EGM was a good magazine, and it certainly became a much better magazine. But especially with these early issues, there's just a lot of typos. It just seemed like maybe nobody was doing any quality control over there. And if you really actually go through and read this entire issue, you will find a lot of typos. And so the first one I'm going to point out here is, this is a review for a game they're calling Scheherazade. And this was, of course, the magic of Scheherazade, which this is spelled wrong in more than one way. Maybe they didn't put the magic of part in there because they didn't have room. I don't really know. As I already talked about this game in the last read-through because it got reviewed in that magazine as well. It's just an adventure game, sort of similar to The Legend of Zelda. Next, we've got DuckTales here. DuckTales, of course, is a highly regarded game, and I want to say it's probably the most noteworthy NES game that got significant coverage in this issue. I think we're sort of at a point where we're sort of between marquee games coming out. So this is like after The Legend of Zelda 2 has come out and after Super Mario Bros. 2, but we're still a ways away from Super Mario Bros. 3 coming out. So DuckTales was actually, I don't know at the time if it was sort of recognized as being this big release, but it's definitely a game that's well regarded now, and rightfully so. Capcom back then had some sort of licensing deal with Disney. Maybe most noteworthy would be like Mickey Mousecapade. But probably DuckTales, I would say, was their best game that came out of that licensing agreement. And it was actually made by several folks at Capcom who also worked on Mega Man. But it is a very good game. I haven't spent enough time with it, or as much time as I would like to, but from what I have, the time I have spent with it, it's a pretty awesome game. And lastly here we have Godzilla for the NES, which is a pretty unnoteworthy game. So, and over here we've got yet another ad from Capcom, this time for 1943. And again, this would be a home computer version of the game. It even says here, fly into battle at your favorite retail software outlet, which isn't that exactly what they said? Oh, here we were launching into battle. Now we're flying into battle. So now we're getting into some 16-bit reviews. We've got two TurboGrafx 16 reviews. The first is Dragon Spirit, and this was a Namco game. This was one of their arcade releases that they ported over to the PC Engine and the TurboGrafx 16. It's a pretty cool, at least in my opinion, vertically scrolling shooter where you're basically, you're a dragon. So rather than this being like a spaceship shooter, it's sort of fantasy themed and you're a dragon. And obviously you can shoot, but then you can also sort of like drop these bombs or like spit these like fire bombs onto the ground. So it's kind of like Xevious or Cybercore that way, where you kind of have to keep track of things happening on like two different planes. And then you have Galaga 90 or Galaga, depends on, you know, how you prefer to pronounce it. Definitely one of the better games on the TurboGrafx. In fact, I would call it a top 10 game. So it's pretty shocking, actually. Ed Samrad gave this a 5. And it says, a 1990 version of Space Invaders. While nicely done on the Turbo, it still boils down to just a basic shooter. 12 years of progress does add fireworks, but if there is a reason to get this game, it has to be the sound. One of the best with choreographed aliens that are comical, just average. And that really makes me think that Ed only maybe played this game for 5 minutes. So Galaga 90 is sort of an updated version of the original arcade game, and when you first start the game, it does play just like the old arcade game, where you have these waves of enemies flying onto the screen, and whichever of them you don't shoot end up sort of just taking up formation across the top of the screen and then just kind of going back and forth. But after you do that a few times, the game actually turns into like a vertically scrolling shooter. And I mean, it's just like a total reimagining of the idea of Galaga. And if you liked that game, this game is just awesome. And Taito ended up doing something very similar with Space Invaders. But like I said, it's just based on his comments. It seems like maybe he just played like the first couple boards of the game and just decided, oh, this is just the same as the original, but with better graphics. And then lastly on this page we have Rambo 3, which I covered in detail in my Sega Genesis in 1989 episode. They give it 6s and 7s, which I'm not sure I really agree with them. I thought the game was pretty good. I personally would give it, I would say, an 8, especially at this time when there are really only a handful of Genesis games out. This was definitely one of the better ones in my opinion. The last 16-bit review they've got here is Forgotten Worlds. Once again, I covered this one in detail in the Genesis in 1989 episode. You can see they gave it 8s across the board, which I definitely agree with. These two games both got sort of more in-depth write-ups later in the issue. Both Game Boy games, obviously. Motorcycle Maniacs. I believe that this was called Motocross Maniacs. I'd have to double check. Oh no, they did. So down here it says Motocross Maniacs. So again, typo, I guess, unless that was some sort of working title and then they forgot to change it when the final game came out. I have no idea, but they like the game pretty well. They think that it's like Excite Bike, which it is, but they think it's like better in every way. I don't think I agree with that. The game is okay, but I would definitely rather play Excite Bike. And then they have here Revenge of Gator. That's Revenge of the Gator, but maybe they had to take out the word "the" to save space. This was one of the first two games by HAL Laboratories for the Game Boy. The other one being Shanghai, which I think I talked about a little bit in the last episode. It's a decent pinball game. It's nothing super great. They gave it 3 6s and a 7, which sounds about right. Then over here we've got an ad for the American Sammy Corporation. And I don't know how well you can see it, but the box art for these two games, we got Amagon and Thundercade. The box art is pretty cheesy. In fact, to the point where if I didn't see the Nintendo seals of quality there, I think I would assume that these were unlicensed third-party games, sort of like Color Dreams. But in fact, American Sammy did have a license. I've never played Amagon. I have played a little bit of Thundercade. It's a vertically scrolling shooter where you drive a motorcycle, which sounds cool, but the game was definitely not well executed. Over here we've got an ad for the Black Bass. This is a well-regarded fishing game for the Nintendo. I've never played it just because I can't get myself that excited about playing a fishing game, especially on an 8-bit system. I think, if you've got a PlayStation or even better a Dreamcast and, you've got that cool fishing controller. But over here we have the famous Quarterman column, and for those who don't know, Quarterman was just the pen name of whoever was writing this column at the time, and it's all just gaming gossip. So we'll just go through a little bit of it real quick. They start off talking about Sunsoft. Sunsoft is looking to bring home some strong games to the NES, and according to a source close to the company, Sunsoft has big plans after Batman hits early next year. So, obviously this was written in like November, December, which makes sense. Some of the possible titles rumored to be in consideration include an adaptation of the computer game Whiz Ball from Europe, a comical gadget game, I don't even know what that means, Gremlins 2 licensed from the movie and expected to hit in time for the film's summer release, as well as a side-scrolling Castlevania-ish version of Batman for the Game Boy, which is the game that I was talking about earlier there. Awesome game. And possibly a title similar to Battleship. I'm not sure what they're talking about because the only game I can think of, especially for the Game Boy, similar to Battleship is Radar Mission, which was not a Sunsoft game. What a lineup. You have something for the game fan in all of us. And they have here, what leading Japanese game company is planning to enter the American game market without Nintendo's approval? Did I hear someone say Pac-Man? And so I can only assume, Namco never made unlicensed cartridges themselves, but they did allow Tengen to release Pac-Man as one of those black unlicensed cartridges. And then he goes on to say, the Sega Genesis was rumored to be a heartbeat away from being the Atari Genesis. After close negotiations between the number 2 and 3 video game powerhouses, Sega opted to give their San Francisco office the go-to to release the Mega Machine themselves. And that's absolutely true. And I think I took it out, but I actually talked about this in the original script for my launch of the Sega Genesis episode. What else do we have here? With wide distribution of the Atari Lynx postponed until 1990, other game companies are reportedly looking into the feasibility of color handhelds. Nintendo is rumored to be working on one, but the Ideal portable system is rumored to be a new unit from Sega that will enable you to play Genesis carts on the go with a portable adapter. And there's no way they're talking about the Nomad already in this would have been late 89. So the only thing I can think is that they're talking about the Game Gear, and maybe somebody got their wires crossed, because of course the Game Gear, you can play Master System games with an adapter, but Sega was not the one that made that adapter, I don't believe. Atari was also rumored to have the rights to, believe it or not, the Nintendo Famicom in the early 80s. As part of the agreement, Nintendo was to produce 4 games a year for the unit, which has gone on to become the NES. Atari opted for the 7800 instead. Put your quarters back into your pocket. The TurboGrafx 16 coin-op system failed to revolutionize the arcades as NEC had hoped. That's a pretty rare system, but I have seen pictures of it on the internet anyway. There was a JAMA TurboGrafx 16. I mean, it was literally just a TurboGrafx 16 inside of an arcade cabinet. So I don't know why anybody would have thought that was a good idea. But anyway, and then here's a hot news flash. Mike Katz, of course, Michael Katz, the video veteran who's been at the helm of companies like Epix, Coleco, and Atari, has just signed on as captain of Sega. Because, of course, Michael Katz was for, a year or so, a year and some change, the president of Sega of America before he was replaced by Tom Kalinske. This is interesting. Also, Nintendo is saying that they will not be bringing their 16-bit to these shores. We'll see, Nintendo. And apparently Nintendo did at one point come out and give an official statement saying that system is not coming out in the United States. And I can only think that, maybe that was to assuage the fears of parents who were dumping all this money into their kids' NES. And then it just goes on to talk about a bunch of games getting price drops. Talks about like some TV shows. And there's really nothing noteworthy down here. Next, just quickly, here's an ad over here for the wireless infrared remote controller by Acclaim. I actually have one of these. It's a pretty cool controller as far as it's a little bit bigger, so it feels a little bit more substantial in like adult hands. But I think as were all wireless solutions at this time, it is infrared based. So you had to have like a receiver that you plugged in to the Nintendo, and you had to maintain a line of sight between the front of the controller and that receiver. So, if you were playing and maybe you're getting a little bit too into it and you turned the controller far enough away from your Nintendo, you would sort of lose that connection. So for that reason, I don't think it's a very good solution. So here we get into that Future Play feature that was advertised on the front cover. And, Steve Harris is just talking about, what an exciting time to be a gamer. You've got all these new systems coming out and the awesome games that are coming out for them. And it says here, with this evolution of the video game in mind, EGM has traveled the world, sending representatives to Japan and Europe, and working with correspondents throughout the world to compile the following article. And then he goes on here to talk about the Super Graphics first. And it says here, the NEC Super Graphics was first discussed in EGM issue number 2 as the PC Engine 2. And he goes on to talk about the specs, that it uses the same 6502 processors and sound chip as the TurboGrafx, so that it maintains backwards compatibility with PC Engine games. And then he goes on to talk about the specs in the Super Graphics that actually make it an improvement. And then he sort of makes an interesting point here. He says, will the Super Graphics be released in the US? NEC denies it, but by naming it the Super Graphics, you can't help but think that they plan to release it over here sometime. And I'd never really thought about it. The way they named the console, it was more of a tie-in to its Western, the Western name of the PC Engine, the TurboGrafx, than to the Japanese name. So I don't know if that means that they were planning on maybe releasing the system here and having that be the system that really took on the Sega Genesis. But, at this time it seemed like maybe that was going to be the next big thing from NEC. Here we talk about the Nintendo Super Famicom, how it's been delayed repeatedly. Talks about them showing off a new flight simulator game called Dragonfly. I've never heard of that. And then they say the flagship of the system, Super Mario World, was not as graphically impressive, but did exhibit some unique twists on the original Super Mario theme. And that was just a really common criticism of Super Mario World, which I think I mentioned in my Super Nintendo launch episode, was that it just didn't really wow people, as being this great 16-bit game. But, the argument I made there is just that I think it really did do a lot of things to take advantage of the advanced hardware, but they just weren't quite so obvious. And then it says down here, like I said before, Nintendo has officially stated that they do not plan to bring Super Famicom out in the US, but with mounting pressure coming from NEC and Sega, that threat carries little weight. Then they go on, well, just first down here real quick. Here is a picture, the elusive Nintendo 16-bit Super Famicom. And as you can see by this time, it has taken on sort of its final form, with the exception of the color of the face buttons on the controller and the power switch on the console. So they go on to talk about the Connex multi-system, and that's a system that made it to the prototype phase and then never ended up coming out. And you can see they've got a little picture here of Ed Semrad actually sitting in this hydraulic chair and playing a prototype system. And they've got a single screenshot here of Attack of the Mutant Camels. But as I said, this system was never released. And then the last console being discussed in this issue, or in this article rather, is the Atari Lynx, which they say out of all the systems we've previewed in EGM, the Lynx showed the most promise for portable gaming. The quality of the color images displayed on the unit's 3-inch screen, combined with the sheer power of the hardware, made us look at the Lynx as the Game Boy of tomorrow that is here today. And I mean, I don't think that necessarily was true. I mean, if you play the Lynx, I think it is. It's an awesome system, and certainly, technically speaking, it's better than the Game Boy. But first of all, it just didn't really end up having the kind of games that it needed to be a success. Of course, it was a bit more expensive than the Game Boy, and it sucked down batteries just like any color system with a lit screen was going to. And then over here we've got an ad for WWF WrestleMania for the NES. I played it a little bit just to check it out, and I really feel like all wrestling games, like the 8-bit wrestling games, they're all basically the same. So I guess at least with this one, you got the WWF license, so you could play as some of your favorite wrestlers. But other than that, I just really don't see the attraction. So now we move on to some of the games that are going to be coming out in the near future. First, they go through the Nintendo. You've got Ninja Gaiden 2, Dragon Spirit, which of course by this time had already been released on the TurboGrafx 16, but there was also a NES port. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, that was actually a port for the NES of an SSI Gold Box game, which would be a PC game, called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Heroes of the Lance. Of course, those SSI Gold Box games are pretty famous or well known. Castlevania 3, obviously a huge game from Konami. Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse. Super C, the sequel to Contra. And other notable releases currently in development or set for release in 1990 include Total Recall, Narc, Arch Rivals, which was like a street basketball game, Blaster Master 2, Afterburner Fantasy Zone, and Shinobi due to appear from Tengen. Over here, now we've got a little, just a single column here about the Sega Master System. You see here they've got a screenshot from Golden Axe, and then Ultima 4, which was, of course, Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar. They put these in here, but then they go into both games in greater detail in the Mega Play insert, so I don't know why they bother here. Here you've got the TurboGrafx 16. They don't have any sort of dedicated blurbs to any TurboGrafx 16 games. They say, even though it's off to a slow start, the NEC TurboGrafx 16 has quickly released close to a dozen games, and it's preparing to launch even more in 1990. And then they go and start talking about some of the games coming out. Currently, there are over 24 titles on NEC's software schedule, including a trio of exceptionally produced titles for the CD-ROM player. And they say Fighting Street, Monster Lair, and Darius. I would not consider Fighting Street to be exceptionally programmed. Other licensed efforts range from Sidearms, the arcade shooter from Capcom, to Fantasy Zone and Space Harrier, courtesy of rival Sega. Other titles worth mentioning, they have R-Type, Newtopia, Ordine, and some other stuff that's not quite so noteworthy. And then over here quickly on the Genesis, they say about the Genesis, clearly the early leader in the 16-bit battle, the Sega Genesis has taken a commanding lead with a superb lineup of games and the promise of even greater thrills to come. And you can see they've got here a screenshot of Truxton, which they mentioned briefly, a video shooter of extraordinary intensity. Truxton, based on a Little Scene arcade game, has they got a typo in there, has the hottest vertically scrolling blasting battles ever seen in a home game. And then down here they've got future releases range from fighter simulators like Air Diver to computer adaptations like Zoom and Sword of Sodan. And Tongue of the Fat Man? I've never heard of that. Is that really a thing?
Welcome to the Fight Palace.
Cyberball, Gain Ground. And then over here they've got the Game Boy. And this is actually kind of true. I never really thought about this. The Game Boy became such a success that we don't really think about the early days of the Game Boy. And they say here the Nintendo Game Boy has now been released for several months, generating only a moderate amount of excitement with its first 4 titles. And, that's actually true. So I got a Game Boy the first Christmas that it was out. So it had already been out for a few months. And I have to say that, when I went back to school, I'm pretty sure I was the only kid, at least that I knew, that had gotten a Game Boy. And, of course, if you go a couple of years down the road, then, of course, some other kids got it. But at least in the early days, I had nobody to talk Game Boy with or trade games with. And so I definitely think there's a lot of truth to what they're saying, where it really did kind of get off to a slow start, which makes sense, really, if you look at some of the early games. They're definitely pretty rough, especially if you take Tetris out of the equation, because that game for sure was a masterpiece. Like Super Mario Land, which they name here. I love Super Mario Land, but even I'll admit that when you look at it compared to other Mario games, it's a little bit lacking. Gradius, the classic Konami side shooter. Who says side shooter? Goes portable on the Game Boy. All the features of Gradius, from options that shadow your ship, selectable power-ups, and an alien armada of cannons, fighters, and bosses that are super tough, are intact. And then they start mentioning some other third-party games that are coming out. Here's NFL football. I would love to have an excuse at some point to tell my NFL football story. God, I hate that game. Revenge of the Gator, which of course ended up getting covered in this issue, so I don't know why they're still even putting it in here. Castlevania The Adventure, Fist of the North Star, Side Pocket. I don't know who's going to get excited about a billiards game, but whatever. And then down here they've got games coming out in the arcade, and the only ones they mention here are Gradius 2 and R-Type 2. Here's Othello, nobody cares. And then over here is the beginning of the Mega Play insert. And as it says here, this was their premiere issue. Not sure why they have a price on it. Maybe they're sort of setting the stage for the idea of this turning into a separate magazine. And speaking of which, I actually have one that I have over here. So I don't know what issue this is, because this is before they started putting the issues on here. But you can see Streets of Rage is the cover story. I actually have a stack of these. And if anybody is interested in seeing me do a read-through of one of these Mega Plays, just let me know, because that sounds like that would be a lot of fun. I think I probably have about a dozen of them or so. But anyway, getting back to this read-through, you can see the cover story here is Golden Axe, although kind of interestingly, they say Sega 8-bit mega review of Golden Axe, but then they're showing a screenshot of Golden Axe for the Genesis. So I don't know what's up with that. And then New Hope for the 8-bit. Talking again about the Master System, and then some new Genesis peripherals. And then finally, Shinobi goes 16-bit in Revenge of Shinobi. As far as home systems go, Shinobi was going 16-bit, because of course the first Shinobi game was on the Master System, but that game was actually a home port of Shinobi for the Sega System 16 arcade board, which of course was 16-bit. So here they're starting off with a little bit of Master System coverage. You can see you got one screenshot of Golden Axe, which is probably because they cover it more in depth a couple pages later. And then you got a bunch of screenshots here from Ultima 4, which, like I said, was Quest of the Avatar. And that was actually a game that was released both on the Master System and the NES. And I did play the game back in the day on the NES, but I've never played the Master System version. And then down here, they say New Hope from Europe. And so they're kind of acknowledging how much more popular the Master System was in Europe. They say, although things may not look as promising as they have in the past for the Sega Master System, there is another outlet for Sega's 8-bit titles that may one day become the only resource for Master System fans. So I think what they're talking about is the idea of importing Master System games from Europe. In Europe, the Master System has eclipsed Nintendo in both sales and popularity, opening up avenues for softs that were never released over here. Remember Outrun 3D? It may not have shown up on our shelves, but in Europe, it's one of the hottest new releases. Other cards and carts that are being enjoyed by our friends across the Atlantic include Bank Panic, Pit Pot, and more. Look for more info on these games next issue. Boy, are we envious. And they show a screenshot here of Psycho Fox. Over here, talking a little bit about the Genesis. Bright future in store for Genesis games and peripherals in 1990. And then they have here's another, that's actually the exact same screenshot of Truxton from a few pages back. There's a tiny screenshot of Gain Ground, and you can see Super Hang On and Zoom, which I already covered in previous episodes. And then here's a bunch of screenshots from Phantasy Star 2. And whenever it is that I get around to doing the Sega Genesis in 1990 episode, then we'll talk about these three games. And then it talked about peripherals. Is there a game network and portable unit in Genesis's future? And then they've got here a picture of the Telegenesis modem. And again, they talk about another hot rumor we've run into concerns a Sega Color handheld that will work with Genesis game cartridges. So I don't know if at one point while the Game Gear was being developed, they were considering the idea of making it more powerful and making it compatible with Genesis cartridges. Because again, I just can't imagine that they were talking about the Nomad already by this time. And then finally, they've got a picture here. It says a new Genesis controller. And this must be like either an artist's rendering or an earlier prototype of the Genesis arcade stick, because it looks a little bit different, but it's got the same basic layout. Here we've got a detailed write-up written by Ed Semrad on the 8-bit Golden Axe. As I said in my history of the history of Golden Axe episode, I definitely don't care much for the 8-bit version. I did take a little bit of heat for saying that from people I think that probably grew up playing that version instead of the 16-bit version. You know, if nostalgia is a powerful thing, but ultimately, if you play that game now, I don't think it's a particularly good port. Here we've got strategies and maps for Ghouls and Ghosts, but they start with level 3, and it says the adventure continues. So perhaps in issue 5, they did the first 2 levels. I don't really know. I mean, this is obviously the first issue of Mega Play, but they may have just done this just in the pages of normal EGM. I really like, this was kind of a common thing to do in game magazines back then, where they would take all these screenshots and then sort of painstakingly overlap them so you can see sort of a continuous shot of what the levels look like. Here you've got the level 4 boss, the Rotten Worm. I actually think that might be the hardest boss in the game. At least it was for me. When I played through this game for the Genesis in '89 episode, I had the hardest time getting past that guy. And then this is going to continue on the next page to the last level of the game, and finally to the boss, how to beat Loki. I actually had someone leave a comment telling me that they were angry with me for showing the ending to the game in my video because I was going to play it and now I'm not going to bother. But this game is going on 30 years old. If you haven't played it by now, I don't think I should have to put up a spoiler alert or not show the entire game. Especially when back then, this was a contemporary game at the time and they showed the ending. So what's the difference? And then unfortunately, this has sort of come off because now we're at the center of the magazine. This is like a fold out. When I first saw this, I got excited. I thought maybe it was like a cool poster or something, but it's just an ad from Culture Brain. You have Kung Fu Heroes on one side here, and then on the other side, you've got to fold it like that, but you've got an ad here for Flying Dragon. Neither one of those are particularly good games. The only thing I would say is maybe I wouldn't even call it noteworthy, but if you ever play Kung Fu Heroes, I swear they stole some of the sound effects for this game out of other Nintendo games. Some of the sounds sound awfully familiar to the original Kung Fu from Nintendo, and there are other sound effects that sound a lot like Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Here now we're getting into some in-depth write-ups on Genesis games, which, like I said, I've already covered on the show, so I'm just going to go through them real fast. Here's The Revenge of Shinobi. Probably, in my opinion, I think this was the best Genesis game that was out up to this point. There were several other games that were good, but this I think was the best one. This was a definite must-buy back then. Next, we've got Forgotten Worlds, also a great game. As I said in the Genesis in '89 video, it was a home port of a Capcom arcade game. For some reason, whoever took these screenshots was pretty enamored with the two main characters and their cutscenes. Even calls them super studs. And once again, there's the sweet Oakley blades. Next, we've got Rambo 3. Once again, I've already covered it. There's the screenshot showing Kurtwood Smith's character. I want to say he was called... I think the character was called Briggs, maybe, or something like that, in Rambo 3. I referred to him as Red Foreman in the episode, and some people corrected me and said that's not Red Foreman, that's Clarence Boddicker, of course, from RoboCop. And then over here we've got Mystic Defender, which was covered in the same episode of my show. Cool game, like I said, probably was really only worthy of a weekend rental back then, at least in my opinion, whereas I personally would have bought Rambo 3. So that wraps up the Mega Play insert. As you can see, it wasn't very long, not very thick. And then we get into the seemingly endless pages of tips and tricks that I was talking about. So I'm not really going to go through these much at all. They're kind of just put in here in no particular order. Like there's multiple tips or tricks for the same game, but then they didn't even like group them together, which I think is kind of annoying. We saw this once before in another magazine, but here's an ad for several Bandai games for the NES, including Bandai Golf, which is a game that I had when I was a kid. Here's an ad for the Joy-Card Sansui SSS. So, as I said in the previous episode, this was a controller for the NES made by Hudson Soft that you could actually plug your headphones into. And then on the other side of the joystick cord was a little cable coming out of that you would plug into the audio output on your NES. And so you can see this kid's got some headphones there. For some reason, I don't know why, he's dressed up like a fighter pilot, and there's some fighter jets in the background. But then I thought it was kind of funny that, down here's this picture of mom and dad sitting on the couch, both reading with smiles on their faces, and it says, "No more TV noise," which just seems like this is just in case a parent happens to see this and says, "Hey, I need to get that for my kid so that we can enjoy not listening to his video games anymore," which is definitely a problem I had when I was a kid. Like, my stepmother would get annoyed with me because, she didn't like the music in the games or whatever because she thought it was repetitive. The only thing I was going to point out as far as the tips or whatever goes, here for Dragon Spirit, they have a tip for changing the size of the screen, and this would be the TurboGrafx 16 version of Dragon Spirit. They talk about how in the arcade this was a vertically oriented game, and at home it's horizontal, and haven't you ever noticed the difference? And it says, well, now you can change Dragon Spirit into original arcade mode by resetting the game 57 times. Like, A, that's probably not good for your system, and B, it's not worth the trouble just to see the screen get shrunk down a little bit. I thought that was kind of like, why would you even put that in the game? Just make it a little code or something. And then over here, once again, we got the same ad for Super Dodgeball that we saw in the last issue, and then there, sadly, is Super Sushi Pinball, which of course never came out. And then once again, we saw this in the last issue. Here is the ad for the Power Glove, which, once again, why couldn't it have been cooler than it was? I wanted it when I was a kid, and I'm sure glad that I didn't end up getting it. Here are the tips and tricks, keep continuing for 2 more pages. Finally, it's over, and we get to the cover story, which is Batman for the NES by Sunsoft. And I really cannot say enough good things about Batman for the NES. In 1989, maybe 88, 89, I would say, I was a pretty big Batman fan. Like, I would go to the comic book stores and I would dig through all their back issues of Batman and just like pull out all these issues from like the 70s that they were selling for like, 50 cents or $1. Because I just love Batman. Like, back then, Batman wasn't popular because, none of the movies had come out yet. And, of course, there was the sort of silly live-action series from the late 60s, which I actually used to watch because they showed it on TV in reruns. But, Batman wasn't really super popular at the time. And then when the movie came out, which was in the summer of '89, that was actually the first movie that I went and saw like on opening day. Like, my dad dropped me off at the movie theater and I had to like get in line just to get in, and the theater was packed. And it was just awesome. I'd never had an experience like that. And I would have been, I think I turned 12 years old that summer. But anyway, back to the game. So as I said earlier, Sunsoft made 3 of these games for the Genesis, Nintendo, and Game Boy, and they were all different. And they're all really good, I think. I think probably the Game Boy game is not as well regarded as the other 2, but I think all 3 of them are good. One of the things that Sunsoft really had going for them is the music in their games. The games that were original. Like Sunsoft published Spy Hunter, which, Spy Hunter has cool music, but they didn't create Spy Hunter, they just ported it to the NES. But, so the music in Batman, and like another example would be Journey to Silius on the NES, also had an awesome soundtrack. Really good controls. You have multiple weapons to choose from that you can select through, so you can be carrying multiple weapons at the same time. Like, Batman can wall jump. This is the kind of game where if somebody were to ask me, like, I don't think there's such a thing anymore, really, in the age of YouTube as a hidden gem. But if somebody were asking for game recommendations that outside of the obvious, which is like the first-party games and the Konami games and Capcom games, I would definitely say Batman. Like, this is a game that I think everybody should own. So you should check it out. As they go through in here, they go through the weapons you get to have, and they go through the different levels. Like, the whole premise is that the game sort of basically follows the storyline of the movie. You go to Axis Chemical Factory in the beginning, and of course at the end you end up in the bell tower. Then we move on to the TurboGrafx 16 section of the magazine, and they're discussing the impending release of the CD-ROM. Here's a couple screenshots for Ordyne, which was an early, cute 'em up, if you prefer that term, cartoony shooter, I would say, a side-scrolling shooter. And what they got down here, they got Space Harrier, and they say other titles, Sega titles like Fantasy Zone are coming out, both good games on the TurboGrafx. And then here they got just one little tiny screenshot. It says CD-ROM games are likely to be a focus for the Turbo into the 90s. And here's a small screenshot of Monster Lair. And then they've got 4 screenshots here from this game. It says one of the most unusual of all the upcoming Turbo releases is Military Madness, a graphic strategy game. And much like I said with Galaga 90, this is definitely a top 10 game on the TurboGrafx 16. Even if strategy games, if that's not normally your cup of tea, if you have a TurboGrafx, you should definitely check out Military Madness. And then appropriately over here, we have an ad for the TurboGrafx 16. As I said at some point, I can't remember when, I don't think this is a particularly good advertisement. They do a good job of showing all the different peripherals you can get. Like, there's the CD-ROM drive, the Turbo Booster, the Turbo Tap, and of course the system itself, and then the Turbo Stick controller. And then they show a few games here where you got 0 screenshots, and instead you've got a picture of like somebody's mouth, eye, and ear. And to me, when you talk about like print media, screenshots are what sell games. And especially with a system like the TurboGrafx that was splashing so much color on the screen, to not show any screenshots to me is just criminal. Then here we get into a detailed write-up of China Warrior. I covered this game in the launch of the TurboGrafx episode. As I said in that episode, the TurboGrafx had like a limited launch in New York and Los Angeles, and during that launch there were only like 3 games available, and then there was sort of a nationwide rollout, and when that happened, there were, I think, about 6 more games that came available, and China Warrior was one of them. It's basically a clone of like Kung Fu for the NES. And I think what it's kind of got going for it, maybe what it's most known for, is that it just had like gigantic sprites. And because of that, they were highly detailed. Like the main character, there's like this Bruce Lee looking guy, but because of the size and detail of the sprite, like you can see all of his muscles and everything. And it's an okay game. Like certainly it I don't think it deserves all the verbal abuse that it gets from people. Definitely not a great game, but it's also one of the cheapest games on the TurboGrafx. So it's worth an evening of fun, I would say. So I think I paid $5 for this game when I got it, but that was like 12 years ago. So I don't know what's cheap on the TurboGrafx anymore, if anything is. And then here you've got a detailed write-up of Galaga 90. Thankfully, it was written by Steve Harris instead of Ed Semrad, since Ed gave the game a 5, which still just blows my mind. That's the same Ed Semrad who gave the Nintendo Entertainment System a bad review when it came out in his Milwaukee Journal column. So, overall, I think, Ed is a respected video games journalist, but certainly he didn't always get it right, although, who does? So I already really talked about this game, so I don't see a need to rehash it. But like I said, it's an awesome game, and if you have a TurboGrafx, you should get it. I think it's actually one of the cheaper shooters on the TurboGrafx. Once again, that's really probably not saying much. Here, first of all, here's an ad for Bishu, which was a company that made like really low quality arcade sticks and third-party controllers for the NES. Don't get any of these. Over here, you got an ad for somebody trying to get you to sell them Nintendo games, and I don't know what this is. Dynasty. I don't know what area code 201 is. Like I don't understand who is saying, "Oh, I want to get a Nintendo," and instead of just going to Sears and buying one, I'm going to call up these people and buy it from them. And then you've got a short article here on the Atari Lynx. I guess I never really looked into the history of the Atari Lynx, so I thought reading this was a little bit interesting. And they're saying that basically if you want a Lynx right now, you are going to need to either live in New York or fly to Japan. And the reason for that is that initially Atari only shipped 50,000 Lynx systems, and those were split between stores in New York City and Japan. Like they sent some to Japan, so sort of a test launch, like what happened with both the NES and the TurboGrafx 16. And they're talking about some of the games that are coming out for it, like California Games, which comes packed with it, and then Blue Lightning and Electro Cop, which were sold separately. And then over here, they're already talking about a new Atari Lynx model. Is that on the way? And of course, there were 2 distinct models of the Atari Lynx. There was the launch model, or the Model 1, and then there was the Model 2, which is what I have right here, which was a little bit smaller. And I like this one better. It seems like a lot of people actually prefer the Model 1. I've actually had this Lynx since about 1995 when I bought it off of a coworker. I definitely think the Lynx is a very cool system, and it's a shame that it didn't do better. But against Nintendo, I don't know how anybody really had any hope. But the Lynx, if you're looking to get into a different handheld system, the Lynx is a really cool one. And actually, a flash card was just recently developed for it that I have. So that's cool. And you can actually even get these modded to output VGA, and then you can just plug it into your computer monitor. Or you can just play an emulator if you're going to do that, I guess. But anyway, they're talking in here about this newer model of the Lynx coming out and how it'll drop the price maybe closer to $100, because the launch price of the Lynx was actually $180, which is pretty steep, because if you had $180 in your pocket around this time, you had your choice of getting a TurboGrafx 16 or a Genesis or a Lynx. And so, as much as I like the Lynx, if this had been like, late 89, early 90, and I was looking to buy a new video game system, you can bet it wasn't going to be the Lynx. Getting close to the end now. Here's the section on the Game Boy. They're talking about HAL Laboratories' first 2 games. Shanghai, which I believe I discussed in the last episode of Let's Read, and then Revenge of the Gator, which is, I mean, it's an okay pinball game for the Game Boy. It's nothing great, but I think it might have been the first pinball game. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure, but this was still from a time when developers were trying to figure out the Game Boy, and that being the case, I think that it's a decent game. And if you were a pinball fan, then it was an okay game to get. And then over here, here's yet another ad from FCI. This time for Boxel for the Game Boy. That's actually a pretty cool game. It's like an action puzzle game. Over here we continue with more Game Boy coverage. Up here you've got Lode Runner and Game Boy news here. The Game Boy is becoming a very hot item in Japan, and plenty of carts are on the way. Even though the portable unit has sold only marginally on these shores, which I was talking about earlier, can these games be far away for American game players? Some of the most exciting titles include Gradius, Ghosts and Goblins. I don't think Ghosts and Goblins, did that ever come out on the Game Boy? I don't think so. Side Pocket, which, like I said, who's excited about that? Lock and Chase, and original titles like Cosmo Tank and Popeye. And then down here they're talking more about Motocross Maniacs, which, as I already talked about, it's sort of Excite Bike-esque, but I don't think it's as good. They seem to think it's like Excite Bike, but better. It's cool that it has all these like power-up items that you can get, but just as far as the basic gameplay goes, I just don't think it's that great. And then here is yet another ad from FCI, this time for Hide Lied, which was role-playing adventure game for the NES. Over here, we have an ad for a place called Toy Club, and this was one of these mail-order video game places. What these places had going for them is that they bought and sold used games. So you could box up, if you had 3 or 4 games you weren't playing anymore, you could ship them to them and basically trade them for other games. And, back then, we didn't have places like Funko Land and whatnot. So unless you happened to live in a city that had a store like this, which I was lucky enough to have one, this might be your best bet aside from selling games to a friend. And like I used to love going through and reading these, and I would always look for games that were cheap but also good. And I would just sort of say, oh, I want to get that game, but I never got any of them because I never had any money when I was a kid. But it was fun to look through here and look at the used prices and look for games that were like affordable, maybe because they were old and they still happen to be decent. I don't really see anything here. The cheapest used game I'm seeing here is Nintendo Baseball, and God, that game sucks. Everything else seems to be at least $20. And the last page here is yet another ad for Kung Fu Heroes. I guess Culture Brain was really trying to get people to buy this game. Like I said, I don't think much of it, but I'm sure there's some fans of the game out there. And then here we've got an ad for POW from SNK. So this was a Nintendo game that was a home port of a pre-Neo Geo arcade game. And it's a pretty cool game. And then the back cover here, lastly, we have an ad for Tecmo. And they're featuring here Tecmo World Wrestling, and they got Tecmo Baseball. But probably more famously, you've got Ninja Gaiden, and of course the awesome Tecmo Bowl. And that's about it. And that is Electronic Gaming Monthly, issue number 6 from January of 1990. That's going to do it for this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.